Voila! Everything you thought you knew about reality is false, or at least should be questioned, and that is why I wrote this book, The Arts and Book of Opposites. Now, I'm not here to necessarily promote the book, but just be honest with you what this is about and why I wrote it, because I'm actually surprised nobody else did. Now, I did a parody trailer about this, but I figured I'd also do an honest trailer. This book is something that I worked on for the past couple months, and as you can see, it's got a cool contrasting background to the black, white, and gray, and these different shades of gray represent this different shades of thought we may have, right? And of course, there's a bunch of world events and all sorts of different things on the side here. So it's a pretty artistic book. I like to be artistic with all of my books, but the point of this book is to get people thinking differently, if that isn't apparent already. That's why we asked the question, what is the opposite, right? You look through this book and you just see, instead of cat and dog toys, instead of television, instead of hallways, instead of coffee machines, instead of strainers, what I did was I literally went through every single item in my house and I said, what is the opposite? Or what lesson does this have to share with us in the opposite, in a sense? And through that process of discernment, we not only become more present and aware of everything within our life, but we see solutions and integrations that we otherwise would have never seen. So this is like an inventor's, wet dream, basically, because it has everything that you can kind of make connections to. You can say, wait, over here, there's an alternative, which is the same alternative as over here. And this relates, of course, to the nature dynamic, which is a system I created in Natureosophy. And you could even see the Natureosophy logo here. So in this aspect of asking what is the opposite, we actually, ironically enough, through looking at material things, start to understand the natural, or the things that are beyond things. And so there is an opposite to even the opposites I'm talking about. There are different ways to perceive the world, and all of that is shared here because not only do you have the things in the very practical side of this book, which is about half of this book, but the other half shares, philosophy and wisdom and different ideas. You get to hear from my religious worldviews, political, whatever, but not my worldviews as so much as it is merely seeing the opposite worldviews, seeing what is typically considered unconventional or alternative, things that, society call taboo, which is why the art and book of opposites, if you break that down, it actually means taboo, right? The art and books of opposites. So what this is can be quite taboo. It can be quite against modern society and everything we think we know. And that is precisely why I created it. Because if we are going to evolve, if we're going to improve, we have to think differently. And it really is just that simple. So if you want the book, be sure to check it out on Amazon and in all formats. And if you have any questions, be sure to let me know. I do use a little bit of humor and irony in this and all that jazz because it's part of the process, and that's why I made the parody trailer. Also, I did use AI for some of the practical solutions because it helps us expand our awareness as to what exists out there. It should be pretty apparent what is and what isn't. And I even share within the book how technology can help us see more opposites, but how nature can help us see the opposites we need to know. And there's a big difference between seeing more and seeing less, and that doesn't necessarily mean need, right? You can see the whole of this reality, but not necessarily still know the whole of this reality, because how much can you perceive? How much can you know? And is it all the matter of knowing? I mean, this is why this delves into the metaphysical, because when you understand the physical, naturally you start to understand, well, where is this metaphysical, right? As we understand the opposite of the physical. So we say, okay, this is a cup, but where did the cup come from? As we start to delineate that, it's like, okay, now we're talking about God all of a sudden. It's like, whoa, where'd that come from, right? But that's because we're trying to find out, like, what's the first cause? And as Nietzsche said, all metaphysics kind of relies on this faith of antithetical values. Some will call it duality or dualism. Boards of Canada calls it twoism, though, there's different perspectives on that too. Boards of Canada is like a cool music artist. But the point is that duality can also be reflected in non-duality, in seeing the oneness of everything, and that's how we can see this cup might actually not be so different from the table. And then if they're all part of this reality, what then is reality? And now we're just going farther and bigger pictured, and now we're seeing things all of a sudden, even though we just asked a simple question of what was the cup and where did it come from and how was it created. Simple questions start to turn into major questions. So this works for kids. There's a curriculum in here to get them thinking differently, looking at the opposite of everything. There's a game in here, there's psychotherapy approaches. I mean, there really is everything that I thought would be valuable to this day and age to help people think the opposite. And I have a whole video that I recorded, about like, you want to know what to do, just do the opposite. People often hear about the USDA recommending carbs and bad fats within the 80s. And now everybody's like, we got to go anti-carb, and we got to promote fats because fats are like awesome. So like, it's the opposite of what we were told. And as people are raised, they realize they were indoctrinated or taught things that they weren't supposed to be taught. So this book stands as a reminder to say, well, maybe some of what you were taught is not so true. And we come to understand that because we see our other potential options. We have tried the alternatives. We have explored other means. But we would never do that unless we ask the question and be able to see beyond, be able to access the opposite. And then maybe we have to ask ourselves, how can we access that? Maybe we have to reach more opposites in our life. And so then we create a whole new reality for ourselves, which accepts a whole new reality of things. And that's what happens when somebody goes through a transformation. Another thing transforms, another thing transforms, another thing transforms. So if this book can transform one thing, perhaps it can transform everything. And then in that process also transform nothing, because our reality is beautiful beyond the artificiality. But hey, this is why metaphysics is so fun, because I can keep talking and explain these things in different ways, and it could all make sense, but it could all also contradict itself. And that right there is the beauty in discipline and nuance, and seeing the grays throughout the blacks and the whites. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. The Arts and Books of Opposites, Practical Metaphysics. Be sure to check it out.